Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our April 3rd, Tuesday at 3 webcast series event, part of our Cloud Cover series, Strategies for Small Businesses. My name is Alan Falcon. I'm the CEO here at Cumulus Global, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day and week to join us here live or to be watching this webcast after the fact and on demand. Before I get into the heart of the content today, a few reminders that the audio is muted to prevent any background noise from interfering with the session this afternoon. So if at any time you have a question or a comment, there's an icon along the top or right-hand side of your screen, and we do have time for Q&A at the end of the session. We do often stop and reconnect midstream as well. This session is being recorded. We generally get them posted within 24 hours. We'll send you an update with a link to the recording, and feel free to share. This webcast in our third Tuesday at 3 or 3 at 3 webcast series is one of several resources that we maintain and develop over time in our resource center located on our website. Please feel free to go to cumulusglobal.com, click on the resource center, and check out what we have. You can get to our blog from there, as well as a library of ebooks and other information, as well as subscribe to our monthly newsletter, see our other webcast series, and our event calendar. So there's a lot of useful information. So we look at our journey today. We're going to talk about how small, mid-sized businesses have been evolving into the cloud and how they continue to evolve. As small, mid-sized businesses, we have some unique challenges when moving to the cloud, so we'll take a quick look at those. And then I'll cover 4 cloud strategies that we see as helping most small and mid-sized entities better take advantage of the cloud beyond what they might be doing today. And we'll pick actually 2 closely related strategies and do a little bit of a deep dive to discuss the implications and the value proposition of taking that next step into the cloud. So let's dive right in and talk about evolving into the cloud. The first thing to know is, when you read technology journals and trade publications and articles about cloud computing, most of it is actually geared at what enterprises do in the cloud, which is very different than the cloud used by small and mid-sized businesses. Because SMBs don't generally have custom developed software, we're less likely to have applications and systems that are custom built, custom purpose, that can be rebuilt or replaced with new software that leverages those cloud native services. So most small mid-sized businesses enter the cloud around email. That's email, calendars, contacts, chat and messaging, meetings, and even file sharing. It's really that productivity suite. Some small mid-sized businesses switch the editors they use, particularly if on the Google platform and they have historically used Microsoft Office. They may stop buying Office and migrate over to the Google Workspace editors as well. And on the Microsoft side, we'll see folks using the web tools, particularly when they're working remotely, as opposed to always having the desktop applications installed. That sort of use around individual productivity exists in the enterprise, but it's really only one component. The enterprise uses the cloud for infrastructure. You've heard about talking about private clouds and hybrid clouds that enterprises build either in dedicated data centers or over public cloud services. And you hear a lot about large enterprises rebuilding internal applications to run in those native cloud services. For small and mid-sized businesses, our line of business applications are most likely to be packaged software that we've purchased from a vendor. And therefore, we're somewhat tied to that vendor's cloud strategy and how we move forward. And so if we look a little bit historical for small and mid-sized businesses and how we evolved into the cloud, back in the day when all of our IT was on-premise before the cloud, or even if it was in a hosted data center, we were pretty much responsible to manage everything. From the network and the physical servers and storage, if we were using virtualization, all the way up to the applications and data. As we moved forward and started looking at something like Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, those are delivered as software as a service products. And those aren't the only ones. You could also look at this and say that to a large extent, simple CRM tools like very basic implementations of Salesforce or simple project management tools fall into this category as well, where all of it is managed by the vendor, right? Including your data and the application itself, meaning you really can't customize what it does. As we are currently there, we have this mix where you might still have on-premise and you might have SaaS solutions as well. But now we're starting as small, mid-sized businesses to realize that there are hybrid options. We can have a mix of those environments, and we can have cloud resident applications and systems. And sometimes that's in the form of a platform as a service, where you might spin up a server and simply run an application on it. We see this often when small, mid-sized businesses, for example, have accounting or financial systems where the SaaS version doesn't have some of the features or the reporting they need, so they'll lift it up and put it up in the cloud. You, as the customer or the user of the cloud service or your IT provider, managed your own application, your own data. Everything else is provided by the vendor, as opposed to infrastructure as a service. You might see that as well, where you're moving entire servers or specific OSs into the environment so you can manage it remotely and not have that on-premise equipment and infrastructure. And so, that evolution of the cloud makes sense. And a lot of what we're seeing now is some of the capabilities being used by larger enterprises are now comfortable and accessible to small and mid-sized companies. But again, as SMBs, we have some unique cloud challenges. And I'll go through those pretty quickly here. The first is that, as I mentioned earlier, we use software packages versus custom-built applications. So our vendor may not offer a SaaS version at all. And if they do, it could lack key features that we rely on. It may not support customizations that we've had built or have been able to add ourselves into the on-premise version. And it may not integrate with our other systems and applications. And we've seen this. We worked with a manufacturing firm with a well-known, well-respected financial ERP system in place. And they had made customizations and integrated it with a third-party inventory system that was specific to their industry. Well, this ERP and financial system vendor has a SaaS version, but it doesn't integrate with the third-party inventory system. And the customizations that were built for the ERP system, the financial system, as well as the inventory system, can't carry forward into the cloud. And so sometimes we want to get there, but we can't because the vendor isn't ready to support us in the way that we currently use their software. The second aspect of our cloud challenge is that, we no longer, when we're running on-premise, everyone was working inside the physical boundary of the office, inside the physical boundary of the network. In remote access now, that we're operating outside of those physical boundaries, still needs that spark. It has to be secure, it has to perform well, be available, be reliable, and be cost effective. And until recently, that was more of a challenge for small businesses because of some infrastructure required. Now, certainly being in the cloud makes remote and hybrid access easier than having on-premise systems. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And really, if we look at a bigger picture, small, mid-sized companies are now really outgrowing that on-premise model. We can look at it in a couple of angles. If we look at it from spending, we'll talk about capital expenditures versus operating expense. And really what that comes down to is that your configuration of your IT services when you're buying physical hardware and software to run on site is fixed. I've talked about this in the past, that when you buy a server, you're trying to project what you're going to need capacity-wise over the next 3 to 5 years, which means you're buying capacity that you're not using now and you may never use. In a sense, that's wasted money. It can be more expensive to scale up as you need it. And certainly once you own the hardware, you're not scaling back, right? So we want to see that, flexible configuration, which is operational spending and expenditures instead of capital expenditures there. The other difference is that the infrastructure on-premise versus cloud is heavy versus light. We talk about having an on-premise infrastructure to support a file server in a Microsoft network. You don't just need the file server, you need a primary and a backup domain controller running. And those same domain controllers will then also support any local email service, database servers, or application servers. That's true, but that's still additional infrastructure. Then you've got equipment on site. You need to back up your data. You need, redundancy and recovery. All of that adds more servers and services into your mix. You need to power it. It needs to be climate controlled. It needs to be physically secure as well as logically secure. There's a lot of infrastructure there. Now, granted, when you move cloud, you still need the secure network environment, but you don't need all of that equipment in place. That equipment that, really requires not only, managing the services they provide, but the hardware, the software, the versioning, the protections, everything that goes with it. And so as we look at that, we've outgrown the on-premise model in part because we can replace things like servers with services, and we can eliminate the cost of managing things, right? So when you think about it, right, you have your Microsoft 365 license that gives you your communication and collaboration tools. It also gives you file services. You pay for those licenses, right? If you still have a file server on site, in addition to paying for the the maintenance and ownership of that file server and the software on it, if you have a managed service provider providing your technology services, you're also paying someone to monitor and manage that hardware and that operating system. And so you can actually eliminate the things you need to pay to manage by moving into the cloud. And so now let's look at some of the cloud, strategies for going beyond where you might be as a small, mid-sized enterprise today and what your next steps in the cloud could be. And so the first strategy, and this is actually the one we started with, taking advantage of and supporting as a business back in 2006, is selective cloud services. And we define these as point solutions that meet specific needs, either technological needs for your technology infrastructure environment or specific to your business. And these selective cloud services often support other cloud services or on-premise solutions. So, example, we started in 2006 offering email security and compliance, which is a fancy way of saying spam and virus protection and archive and e-discovery services. Back in 2006, 99% of email servers were still on-premise, but we could deploy a cloud service that stopped the spam from flowing from the internet to that on-premise server. It saved bandwidth. It reduced the processing and disk space and queuing demands of the on-premise email servers. So even before people started moving their email and related communication services into the cloud, email security and compliance was a point solution that could protect and extend the life of that on-premise email environment. And even now, when we have in-cloud email services, things like advanced threat protection, archive and e-discovery for industry or legal compliance are still point solutions that we can add on to your basic email service to meet your technology and your business needs. Other examples include single sign-on, mobile device management, file sharing, and not just sync and share, but tools for large file transfers, things that can't be attached to emails, and business continuity and disaster recovery, which can apply to both cloud-based services as well as continuing to back up and providing failover or emergency restore and emergency operation services for equipment and applications and databases that still have to run on site. The second strategy we call server to service, and like the name applies, we're replacing server or things with services. And so we define that, saying, yep, you're going to replace those services with managed cloud services. And that could be replacing on-premise or even hosted environments. And again, it's targeted at specific needs of the business or your technology infrastructure, and will support specific cloud services as well as others and other on-premise services. So some great examples I've already talked about is the file server, right? So if you're a Microsoft, if you're in the Microsoft 365 environment and you want to replace your file servers, you will do it using a combination of OneDrive, SharePoint, particularly the SharePoint file services, and Microsoft Teams. In the Google Workspace environment, it's shared drives and Drive. That'll be that replacement. And there's actually quite a bit of flexibility of how you manage the structure, the permissions, access, whether or not you allow local syncing or local caching of content. It all comes into play. You can set something up that mimics the way your file servers used to look and feel, or you can set something up that will be familiar to your users from an access and availability and a usage standpoint, but will actually encourage them to use some of the more advanced collaboration features. Other examples include identity and user management, where we can replace domain controllers with with cloud-based services, either Microsoft, Google, or third parties. Print servers is another thing. You don't necessarily need print spooling software running on a physical machine in your environment or a dedicated print server itself. We now have cloud-managed print services. So many examples of moving servers to services. Now, the last two strategies are really closely related. Lift and shift and the remote desktop VDI strategy. So I'll talk about scope here a little bit, and then we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into these topics. So lift and shift, as the name implies, is taking business applications and systems pretty much as is from an on-premise or a hosted server to cloud-based servers. And so effectively what you're doing is, even if they're running in virtual servers on physical hardware on-premise or in a data center you're leasing or renting somewhere, we consider those fundamentally the same. You've got a fixed environment, you've got dedicated hardware, fixed configurations, requires all of the same physical as well as logical management and services. Moving them into cloud-based services, you're moving them into much more flexible environment. So, for example, you can redeploy a server in Microsoft Azure or GCP by changing the number of CPUs, the amount of memory involved, things of that nature, without, in a sense, physically rebuilding it, right? In fact, even logically rebuilding. You have the ability to scale resources and processors because you're not actually running on a physical server. You're running on a collection of resources that are being presented as a server. When you do a lift and shift, there are two primary ways for you to access that environment. One is to create a secure VPN, either from your office network up to the cloud, or from individual machines, and those aren't mutually exclusive, or to leverage remote desktop services where on your local machine, you're either going into a web browser or opening some thin client software that connects you, and you're actually running an image of a desktop computer up in the same cloud and on the same secure private network that your servers are, that you've moved up there. And those local access options are the same with the remote desktop VDI environment. The difference with the remote desktop VDI environment is that you start by lifting and shifting applications, but the desktop is definitely going to run in that cloud environment on that secure private network with systems and applications. You won't do any local processing on your local machine whatsoever. And in that sense, it's sort of not a hybrid environment. You're really all in cloud. And so that thin client agent or that web browser becomes necessary. Those both provide a level of encryption and security. Some people will establish a secure VPN as well as an added layer of security. In certain industries and in certain use cases, that's appropriate to have the extra overhead and the extra cost. And what's nice about these strategies is, for the most part, you can take your applications and systems as they run today, configure them to run on comparably configured cloud server environments, cloud storage. You have the backup and recovery capability, business continuity. You're protected against disruptions more than you are with local, and you can certainly get that performance component in there as well. A side effect, by the way, of the remote desktop environment is because your laptop or your desktop computer is only being used for the screen, the keyboard, and the mouse action, and not for the processing. You can run more robust applications without having to upgrade or replace your desktop environment. And so we see, well-maintained hardware. You can extend the life cycle of your end user devices, pretty much by 2 years, and avoid, again, that type of capital expenditure. Stretch out that replacement cycle and stretch out your budget, because you're not putting the processor demand on and the memory demand on your local machine. If you think about it, in the last generations of Windows, we've gone from saying, hey, you really need 2 gig of RAM, then you need 4, and now the real standard is 8, 4 for the operating system, 4 for the applications. But in the remote desktop VDI environment, you're not running the applications locally. So that system you have with the 4 gig of RAM is going to serve you well, should serve you well, even as you run more robust applications up in the cloud. And thereby you can extend that life cycle and avoid replacing a laptop every 2 to 3 years. For now, you're more likely to replace it in a 3 to 5 year cycle. So now let's look at a deep dive a little bit more with lift and shift and the remote desktop and VDI solutions. And in doing this, I want to take a step back, okay, and talk about what happens when you go to migrate something in the cloud. And granted, most of us, well, actually, right now, about 54% of small and mid-sized businesses are using some form of cloud computing. And the vast majority of that are the productivity suites, whether it's Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, Zoho has a suite, Amazon has a suite, much less popular, but they're out there, right? So there are options there. We go beyond that, we start talking about line of business applications, or G&A applications, if you will, such as finance, accounting, ERP systems, marketing systems, sales management tools, all the other aspects of your business. When you look at that system to migrate, what are your options? And there are really 6 options. One, you can decide you don't need the application or the system anymore. You can simply retire it. That's actually pretty common in large enterprises. They realize that applications that people might be using that are redundant, that they don't need anymore, and so they don't move them. They just have people switch which application they're using as they move into the cloud. The next is to retain it. And again, for even in small and mid-sized businesses, there are times where you will retain or you'll need systems on-prem. So for example, if you're manufacturing or distribution, process control systems that you're using in your facilities, in most cases, in almost all cases even, are probably best maintained on-site and local for optimal performance and safety, right? That said, a lot of what you're doing that you might think needs to be retained may not be. It's always worth a detailed exploration. And so you can retire, you can retain. The other 4 options get into saying, okay, we're not getting rid of it. It's not going to stay on premise. Now what? When we talk about lift and shift, we're really talking about rehosting, which is moving your application, from where it sits on a physical server into those logical servers in the cloud. We can also be talking about replatforming, and that's where you rehost and you do some additional integration to take advantage of the cloud environment. So sometimes replatforming might be saying we're going to replace, instead of replacing the physical server running a SQL Server database version with a logical server running a SQL Server database license, we're going to do a little bit of work and leverage the SQL service that exists in Microsoft Azure, right? That's where you get into replatforming. Replatforming also comes into play when you look at your ancillary services. So again, you're running a financial system. Let's say you're running your accounting system on premise. You've got an accounting application that runs over SQL Server database. You've got a database server. You've got an application server that may also be your file server, and you want to move that into the cloud. Well, you also have a backup solution for that somewhere. Hopefully, you've got a local backup copy, a copy in the cloud, and ideally, you have a business continuity service that says, hey, if something really goes wrong with these systems, I can spin up an image of those systems someplace else until I get things fixed. So I can return to operations, even if performance is not as great, quickly while the IT folks do their magic and get everything working again and get everything optimal. So you've got the rehost and replatform. Another option is to repurpose. And sometimes for small businesses, this will happen. It's not the focus of what we're talking about today. And that's where you say, gee, I'm running QuickBooks Premier Edition, and all the features I use and all the reports I use are available in the online version of QuickBooks, the SaaS version. So I'm going to stop buying the physical license that installs on my local machine. I'm going to subscribe to the web-based, to the cloud-based SaaS service of QuickBooks. That's a repurchase. You've got A, you're rebuying it, but as B, because it's cloud-based, it's not physical anymore. And then the fourth is refactor. And this is where, it's obviously not something you can do with a package software because you don't control it. But if you have custom-built software or internally built software, this is where you actually re-architect and reconstruct the software to take advantage of the native cloud services and the microservices that are available, right? So again, instead of installing a database on an image of a server and connecting it to, a storage structure that looks and feels like physical disk, even though it's logical and not physical, refactoring says you're going to rebuild that to use the SQL service, to use multi-tier storage capabilities, to use job and task management, to use performance monitors. You're basically you're not starting from scratch, but you're re-engineering the entire application. Now for SMBs, all of these aren't practical, as I've mentioned before, and so we're sort of focusing on rehosting and replatforming here today. When we talk about rehosting, as I said, you're moving existing servers to cloud servers with a similar configuration. The cloud's going to provide your network, secure. It'll be virtually private, if you will. It's your network. No one else has access to it within that public cloud service. And you can connect by a VPN network to network, or typically most people would do remote desktop access and have that virtual desktop infrastructure in place. Once moved, we can optimize that environment for performance and cost. So for example, because the cloud is based on usage, we might look, and we're working with a customer now that, typically has, 3 to 5 people accessing this one system that we're rehosting. There are times, however, where as many as 15 might need it. So we're setting up the environment rather than, a big logical server to have those virtual desktop clients on smaller ones. And so basically, one server will handle 4 or 5 end users. So most of the time, only one server would be running. When an additional person needs to sign in, it will quickly spin up an additional server for as long as needed, potentially a third server during high volume times, and things scale back. And then in the evening, when no one's accessing it, we might actually run our backups and then shut things down for a couple hours. But again, we can manage the cost and the operational hours by scaling the environment not only to the need of the business on a macro sense, but even on a day-by-day, hour-by-hour, monthly business cycle sense. And with that rehosting, for this particular client, when we move that application up, it happens to be their ERP system, we will be able to also replace their domain controllers. They won't need those anymore for identity management and access control. They will no longer need the dedicated backup server they're running and that infrastructure and equipment. All of that will be managed cloud to cloud within the cloud environment. And we'll be able to provide them better security, permissions management, and DLP, given the tools that are available to us within the cloud environment where we're removing them. So that's sort of an example of how a rehost looks and feels. Taking it a step further, down the road, we may decide to replatform. For this implementation, it would be, the modification to the architecture to leverage cloud efficiencies for them would be moving off a logical machine in the cloud that's running a SQL Server license into the native SQL services. We could also see implementing tiered storage is a way to help them manage current and past project work in a way that would also lower their monthly operating expense. Other things that can happen in a replatform beyond those examples is connecting business apps to collaboration suites, and here it does different how you do that in the Google and the Microsoft environment. In the Microsoft environment, for example, if you're running a business application that sits over SQL Server or the SQL services in Azure or other common databases, you have connectors that will bring that data into Power BI and let you build your own reports, build interactive dashboards with drill down and multiple views to give you better access to and better understanding of your data, turn that data into actionable information. And so, beyond basic connections of saying, hey, I can have a report dropped in a certain directory and get a notification that's available. That's cool. But actually getting you more and better access to the information you need to run your business is even better. And replatforming is where you get into making those connections and taking advantage of that added value of the cloud environment. And it is less expensive and requires less coding to do it in cloud environments that were built to do this from day one than it is to retrofit your on-premise systems and services. So now let's talk about effort and impact, because oh my goodness, how complicated is this and how much is it going to cost, right? So there's two different graphs here. The one on the left, the vertical axis is cost, effort, and skills required, and that's the y-axis. The x-axis is the time to migrate, right? So in some sense, repurchase is the easiest, because if you're going from the on-premise, the local version of QuickBooks to their cloud version, they've got tools that are going to migrate your data and bring up your reports and translate your templates. And there might be some specific manual work you have to do if something's not quite compatible or doesn't move cleanly. You might need to do a little repair or problem solving. But they've got support. The vendor provides support to help you do that, or can charge you a little bit of money to do that for you. It's not overly complex. Next is rehost. It takes a little bit more time to migrate. You got a little more planning to do. You want to scope and you want to take into factors about scaling, and is it one big environment or multiple small environments that scale up and down based on usage. And so there's a little more cost, effort, and skill to get there, and it takes a little bit longer. Refactoring is the most, because in effect you're rebuilding software. We won't get into requirements analysis, design, development, testing, and validation, and then migrating, running dual, things of that nature. But so that can be major projects. But between refactor and rehost is that replatform, where you might even start with the rehost and then over time do additional integration and take advantage of some of the native cloud features. In the second one, we talk about the value it provides, right? And the business agility and value. Now, because it's so inexpensive to do, replacing really gives you, high value. Refactoring does as well, but it comes at a much higher effort. So when we look at this, we look at replatforming and rehosting as really the best balance, particularly for small and mid-sized enterprises, between the effort it takes to do it and the value you're going to get short-term and long-term. And hopefully all of this is starting to click together and make a bit of sense. And so from an effort and impact standpoint, for small and mid-sized businesses, rehosting and replatforming generally make the most sense, particularly, again, since you can start with a rehost and do replatforming in stages or in small projects as needed or as desired over time. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposition. Refactoring tends to be an all or nothing proposition. And when you hear about large enterprises moving into the cloud or even switching clouds, they're doing a significant amount of work internally or with consultants or development houses to make that happen. And certainly, while it takes very little effort to retire or retain systems, the value that you get, you don't really get any additional value. It is what it is, and you don't get additional agility, the ability for your business to adapt to changing market conditions and business conditions. And so rehosting and replatforming is a pair, if you will, provide that best value of effort and return on investment. So there's some other factors that make the lift and shift in the VDI environment attractive. Let's talk about end of life. If we look at Microsoft, Windows Server 2012, Windows 8 have expired now. They've passed end of life. SQL Server 2012, the most recent version, expired back in July. I'd have to look at when the 2016 versions are set to end of life. Point is, at some point it's going to happen. Typically, your server hardware is going to have a 5-year lifespan. Sometimes we stretch it and take that risk. As I mentioned earlier, when you refresh that, refreshing that hardware means overbuying because you're projecting growth and resources and that might be needed in the future. Servers 5 years ago, 8 gig of RAM was considered luxury. Now 16 is the norm, 32 is the luxury, right? You might not need all that RAM or all that disk space today, but you buy now because it's hard to reconfigure the hardware, and you want to make sure all your hardware, your accessories, your disks are compatible and available. You're looking at it. You also have multiple servers in your environment, so this multiplies based on the number of servers you had. And while virtual machines in the local environment, in your on-premise environment, can reduce the physical hardware you need, it adds another management layer, another software layer, and another cost layer into the environment. And yes, running an environment with fewer, bigger pieces of hardware and VMs could end up being more cost-effective from a hardware-software standpoint and licensing standpoint, but you've added complexity and management, which has different costs, soft costs that come into play as well. And oftentimes, companies realize after they've made that decision that they need to invest in monitoring and management tools to stay on top of it, to keep the environment functioning well, available, and reliable. And so in the physical world, you hit end of life. Things end of life in the cloud, but they migrate into the replacement. So again, Microsoft says, this Azure server with this mix of, memory, CPU, cache, etc., is going to go away. We'll have a different quote unquote model that offers that comparable, or you can scale up and down. You can make those changes without having to reinstall your software in your environment. You can fit it in and scale up and down as you need it. Another advantage to these environments is if you have multiple locations. Again, if all of your technology and your computing is on-premise at your primary location or split across multiple locations, connecting them is expensive. Securing those options equals cost, whether it's a managed MPLS network service, a software-defined WAN, point-to-point wide area network services, or using VPNs over the public internet. All of that requires hardware, software, management, networking fees. It gets expensive, and you pay a performance price, right? So granted, a lot of small businesses with multiple locations will create point-to-point VPNs. Those can use the public internet, although you lose control over performance to some extent. It gets complex to configure, and there's a performance overhead. So when you move into the cloud, everything you have is in your Microsoft or your Google or your Amazon data center. That's a single point of contact. You're minimizing the infrastructure you need. Yep, you still need a router, firewall, switches, wireless access points, and some wiring. Those should be on protected power. Great. You need that in every location. You need that even if you're doing on-premise. What you don't need is the communications equipment, going point to point, the additional firewalls and routers you need to manage that and provide redundancy, the VPN software that's going to connect your facilities, and the management software sitting on top of that. Cloud is better suited for remote and mobile users. And again, these are some of what's driving us into the cloud right now, right? The work environment has changed. The business environment has changed. People working out of office, whether it's work from home or otherwise remote, is for most companies going to continue to be the norm. And so traditionally, it's very expensive infrastructure, VPN concentrators and gateways, remote desktop service gateways coming into your on-premise, connection brokers, or even PC to PC mirroring, where you just buy the software and you have a dedicated PC for someone in the office and they have their PC at home and you mirror it off. It gets expensive, it can hurt performance, it's hard to maintain and keep running reliable, and more importantly, in some respects, is you have a very different user experience. What you see, how you log in the morning, the performance, how you're able to access information and applications in a traditional remote environment to on-premise differs greatly if you're in the office and you're at home. And that creates confusion or challenges for some users and increases your support costs, and it can hurt performance and productivity. In the cloud, again, everything's going to the same place. You can leverage any available internet service. Your connectivity is device and location agnostic. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. Your user experience is consistent, whether you're in the office, at home, in a WeWork or other co-working location, on an airplane, doesn't matter. You have that comparable user experience. And so when we look at that cloud remote desktop, which is a component of the virtual desktop infrastructure, and what an infrastructure looks like, again, you're avoiding on-premise hardware, device and location agnostic. You're leveraging the client just for internet access, and you've got scalable resources. Here's an architecture of an environment, if you will. You can see that on the upper left, you've got your remote clients, your small business. It could be 1, 2, 10, 50, doesn't matter. They go in to the virtual environment that's up in the cloud through a gateway server that provides the connection, connects through where you have your active domains, your Active Directory services, DNS file servers, connection and licensing broker to get you in, which then lets you spin up session hosts, right? And that's where your virtual client works. And so your desktop is actually running on one of those remote desktop session hosts. This architecture for a client had relatively small. They were looking at having only 2 to 4 people per host and having it scale up and down regularly throughout the day. And so there's your client. Those connect through to data storage that's allocated to the environment. Now, if there was a custom business application, you just see an Azure-based server running in that environment on that secure private network up in the Azure data center in the Azure environment that would run that application, and those desktops running on the RD session hosts would connect to that application the same as your physical laptop or desktop connects to the physical server when it's running on premise. The nice part about this environment is, hey, it connects internally within the Microsoft ecosystem to Office 365. So the same identity that gets you into your email and calendar, into your in access to your OneDrive and SharePoint and Teams environments is the same identity you use to connect into the data center and access your business applications, your desktop, and things running there. And so it really creates a streamlined environment. And again, because you're in a professionally hosted data center with built-in redundancy, you're less apt to be impacted by disaster or other business disruptions. Even in the face of disaster, you can't make it into your office or your home and there's no power. So long as you get to someplace with power, you can physically get to someplace with power and internet, and you have a device or access to a web browser, you can get in and get back to work. And so your business resiliency is much greater in the cloud than it is on-premise as well. And that business continuity is really important because it's more than just restoring your data when something goes wrong. If you're running systems on-premise, there's two metrics you want to be aware of. One is, how long does it take you to return to operations? How long will it take you to get your business up and running? So you're running on-premise, even if you have offsite backups, and that's the level of support you have, the level of capability you have. If your disk crashes on your file server, best case, your new disk is arriving the following morning. You then need to install it, format it, potentially rebuild the system, and then restore your data. which could take a couple of days, you might be easily 3 to 5 days before you're up and running again. And then you've returned to operations, but not normal operations, because how have you been running your business? Have you been doing it on paper? You've got to get all those transactions in. Did you lose any data that has to be re-entered? All of that has to be taken care of, because it's going to take time and resources to do before you're really returning to normal operations. Now, if you have a continuity solution and you're running on-premise, then yep, your server crashes, you have an image somewhere, you can run that up, you can start working, your return to operations is quick. You still have to go through all of that work that I mentioned before to return to normal operations. And that becomes very dependent on availability locally of hardware, systems, etc. And the cloud has talked about how you're limiting your disaster risk. You're in professionally managed, large-scale data centers with built-in redundancy within the data center, built-in communication paths that are designed to be resilient from natural disasters. You can add geo-redundancy, so you're running in 2 parts of the country at a minimal cost. And you've got better recovery options because you're already in the cloud. So relocating servers or duplicating servers in other regions is doable through software, through management. You've taken the physical aspect out of your business continuity. And you still need to have backup for your data, right? So you can back up and restore to deal with data corruption or deletions, malicious acts, etc. But it's all contained within that cloud environment and that cloud ecosystem. So I've covered a lot of ground. We've delved into in depth. We talk about 4 strategies for going beyond and things to consider to go beyond. Selective cloud services that meet specific technology or business needs, moving from servers to services where possible, or lift and shift, or even more ideally, moving to that remote desktop, virtual desktop infrastructure environment. So how do you know what's right for you? Well, the first thing you do is you can contact us, bit.ly/CG intro call, or use the QR code up on the screen. Why? Assess your current environment and your needs. How are you using the cloud today? Do you understand where you are in your on-premise, what's left on-premise, and what the life cycle of those, of that hardware and those software and services are? Do you know what's available from each of your vendors with respect to cloud-based services, and how does that play in? And how are your business, your workplace culture, and the way people are working and your markets changing? Do you need to be more hybrid? Do you need to have better support for remote? Do you need to keep people on premise? Those are the questions to be asking, because the answer to those questions will decide what should move, when, and how aggressive do you want to be in making those moves. Once you look in that, once you get a sense of that, define your value proposition. Take a holistic view of IT services, not just the cost of moving, but how does that compare to the cost, hard cost, indirect, direct and indirects, and soft cost of inaction? The status quo, if you're not improving efficiency and productivity, if you're not better managing your total cost of ownership, you've got an opportunity cost. You're spending money you don't need to. It can even be hurting your business in tangible and intangible ways. So take that holistic view. How would changing how you're using the cloud fit into all of your IT services? And are there additional opportunities for improved productivity, efficiency, and effectiveness? With that, you can plan your solution. You can have a strategy that says, we'll be all in cloud, but the tactics will really say what you do, when, and how, and why, and how you might phase that, and where and when you're going to make those investments, and what you expect the value proposition and the return to be for each of the tactics you choose to execute. And then finally, execute. It's not surprising a fair number of companies get all the way through the planning phase and then they don't pull the trigger. They get nervous. Something else comes up. They decide to hold off for some reason, and they never execute. And sometimes by the time they're ready to move forward, their analysis is stale because business and the environment change, right? And so assess, define, plan, and be ready to execute. With that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. If you have questions now, please use the icon to open the questions window along the top or right-hand side of your screen. Also, feel free to contact us. There's a contact us QR code. You can schedule an intro call with one of our cloud advisors. We're happy to talk one-on-one with your specific situation. There's no obligation here. There's no charge. The services we're talking about may not be right for your business. We're happy to provide guidance, give you food for thought, even if you're not ready to move forward with anything specific at this time and you're still in the exploratory phase. If you want to get in touch with me directly, my phone number is there. I'll tell you I'm bad at answering the phone and voicemail. Best to send me an email. My address is there. I don't have an assistant, so I process all of my emails myself as a way to contact me. At this point, I'm going to take a quick break from the microphone and stop the recording for the folks who will be watching this on demand. So if you are watching on demand, I want to thank you for doing so, and feel free to reach out and follow up with our team with any questions or comments you may have.